recording to start with. Got that part right. Now, what else can I get right? Let's see. As we get started, I want to give thanks to Pastor Greg and Dr. Travis for recommending the books and the videos that have allowed me to put together the information I'm using during these 5 Wednesday evenings. Because without their recommendations, I'd probably be making up some very inaccurate stuff from dubious Wikipedia sources and Google. And
that's what I do in class. It's all right.
So I'm glad to have the resources from them because I'm learning all of this stuff as we go. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to do some chronological jumping around. Not too fast, Beverly, so we won't jostle you, but you will all need to fasten your seatbelts because we're going to go back and forth in time, because that was the best way I could figure out to provide you with some manageable pieces of historical context and geopolitical background, while also getting a peek at some of the apocryphal writings each week, because I didn't want to save all of those for the end after we got all of this long geopolitical and geographic and historical context in. So we're going to do a little bit of the dates and the times and stuff, and then we'll take a little break and look at a couple of the apocryphal writings, even though we haven't gotten to the place where those were written yet in our look at the time. Okay. So we're going to start with some very basic events for some of the major events described in the Hebrew scriptures or the Jewish scriptures. And let's see, a screen share by me would be the way to go. And let me see, how about, no, not that one. I like that one better. We'll start with that. All right, you all see that. I'm going to move this off so that I can see the whole panel here. Now, I must warn you that I cannot see you. So if you want my attention, you'll need to unmute and say something, okay? I'm fine with that. Okay, so what we're going to do first is we're going to do some connecting the dates. We're going to look at a few of the older dates in the Hebrew scripture that kind of lead us up to what we're talking about. First, we're going to look at what approximates the fall of Israel or the northern kingdom sometime after 722 BC, and then several decades after that. The northern kingdom fell to Assyria, but Judah, which is the southern kingdom, maintained a sense of sovereignty for a while longer. But apparently after the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon besieged Jerusalem. And this is how 2 Kings reports that very briefly. It says, in his days, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came up. Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. So the first time around, Nebuchadnezzar had a successful siege against Jerusalem, and that resulted in Judah paying tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. But during his 4th year, they decided to stop paying. Maybe they didn't think they were getting their money's worth. Well, that led to another siege in Nebuchadnezzar's 7th year, which culminated with the death of Jehoiakim. And that was when there was exile to Babylonia of King Jeconiah and some members of his court and quite a few other folks. So more exiles of Jerusalem's succeeding leaders happened over the years following that. Most scholars put the fall of Judah, that is Jerusalem, in 586. So the southern kingdom fell to Babylon in 586. Now, just to give you a little bit of the lay of the land, to give you a look at what some of that geography looks like with Assyria, the Assyrian kingdom, and the Babylonian kingdom. This is kind of a map of how that might look. You'll see the blue line, the darker blue line in the center of that orange there is the early Babylonian Empire. And then the big orange solid blob is the Assyrian Empire, which you see it goes all the way down into Egypt. And then the green line shifts and shows the new Babylonian Empire, which goes down and takes in Jerusalem in the middle 6th century BC. So that's just a look at how the kingdoms kind of shifted as they went back and forth with one another. So now we'll come back and connect some more of the dates. What I'll have to say is when it comes to this sort of thing, when you use a big stick for diplomacy and power grabbing, there's always a good possibility that someone else has an even bigger stick. And since you're already playing the big stick game, they'll probably use the bigger stick on you. And that is precisely what happened when in 539 or thereabouts, the Babylonian Empire fell to Persia and King Cyrus. And then a date that fits with our readings in scripture is that somewhere around 515, it appears that the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem was dedicated, the first time it was rebuilt. And we're going to get a synopsis of that in just a few minutes in a very helpful video that's going to give us some of these details. Then in 478 BC, also related to scripture, Esther, a Jewish teenage orphan in the Babylonian capital, wins Xerxes' beauty pageant, which has the creepy grand prize of a big fat Persian royal wedding. Therefore, she was required to marry King Xerxes, who was also known as Ahasuerus in some of our translations of scripture. And then, of course, I'm sorry. Did someone say something? Okay. And this, of course, this is the story of Esther, where with encouragement from her uncle Mordecai, she is the major one to foil the plot of what we like to call wicked Haman, who was attempting to exterminate the Jews. And as far as our scripture goes, somewhere around the year 456 BC, Ezra comes to Jerusalem to teach the law. And again, we'll hear more about that in just a few minutes with this brief video. And a few years later, in 445 BC, Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and especially the wall, which is what he starts with. And then somewhere around 440 is when we think the book of Malachi was written. And we'll hear more about that later. So here's a really simple timeline that Pastor Greg shared with me that I found helpful, which tells you somewhere around the years that particular biblical books that we're talking about, Ezra, Esther, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi were written, as well as some of the dates of people moving back and forth from Babylon and the Persian Empire to Jerusalem and back. So that gives you just a little bit of some of the dates that I just told you, just kind of puts them on a timeline there so you can see it. So if you'd like to come back to that video and stop it sometime, get a better look at that, you are welcome to do that. Now, two of the biblical characters who play an important role in the story of Judah's return from exile and the rebuilding of the temple and of the city of Jerusalem are Nehemiah and Ezra. Now, I have a brief little video here, and I just want to tell you that apparently there is another pronunciation that's not a South Georgia pronunciation of Nehemiah, and it is probably more accurate. It is Nehemiah. Okay, so when you hear her say Nehemiah, you think Nehemiah. Okay? All right, so here's our first brief video about those two and some of the history that goes with them.
Way in the back of the Bible, where the pages are still crisp and unturned, there are two books that go very much unnoticed and that really do deserve more attention. They are the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah were born into a community of Jews that had been forcibly exiled from Judea and relocated to Babylon after the destruction of the First Temple. They lived in what was known as the Persian diaspora around the year 450 BCE. They both returned to Judea with a mission. Nehemiah came to rebuild the ruined city of Jerusalem, and Ezra came to rebuild the Jewish soul. Before we can even get into the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we should do a little background. After the exile, the Jewish community in Babylon went into lockdown and isolated itself in order to preserve its identity and to keep its members from assimilating. Laws against intermarriage, which had been at times ignored in Judea, were now being strictly enforced in Babylonia. Judaism in Babylonia maintained itself with its sacred books and its separate schools of study. For 50 years, the Jewish community was not allowed to leave Babylonia, and then a miracle happened. A Persian king named Cyrus took control of the Babylonian throne. The Babylonian Empire collapsed, and the Persian Empire now began. And here is where the Book of Ezra starts. In 538 BCE, the new king Cyrus issues a decree. The Jews are free to go back to Judea. King Cyrus returns the looted contents of the first temple to the Jewish community and vows to underwrite this new second temple's construction. Now, before you think Cyrus is a really nice guy, let's keep in mind what he's getting out of this. By allowing the Jews to rebuild their temple and practice their religion in Judea, Cyrus gains their unconditional loyalty, especially since he will be paying for the project and controlling the money. It gives him a foothold in the area without having to move a single soldier there. The idea of moving back to Judea electrifies the community of exiles. While many in the Jewish community of Babylon have grown comfortable and decided to remain, 42,000 exiles leave a country that they lived in for 50 years and return to a land that was then called Yehud Medinata, Aramaic for the state of Judah, Aramaic being the international of the day. This return was, in a sense, a precursor to the Zionist movement that would again take place some 2,500 years later. When the 42,000 arrive in Jerusalem, they find an abandoned, burnt-down city whose walls are breached and collapsing. They get to work. It takes 2 years just for the foundation of the next temple to be completed. The community gathers together in great celebration. The elderly who knew Solomon's temple weep with mixed emotion. Temple construction proper is set to begin, and then, as luck would have it, King Cyrus dies in battle. A municipal governor, along with the local people known as Samaritans, used this opportunity to try and get the project stopped. According to Ezra, the Samaritans were a people who had moved in and filled the vacuum left by the Jewish exile. They were practicing a competing version of Judaism, and they had a temple of their own. They tell the new king of Persia that Jerusalem is, quote, a rebellious city, harmful to kings and states. If this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, you will no longer have any portion in the province of Judea. The king gets the message. All work building the temple is forcibly halted. A generation passes. Another guy, King Darius I, takes the throne. The Jewish community restarts temple construction before even getting permission. Again, the Samaritans appeal to King Darius to stop the project. The new king checks the archives and he discovers that yes, Cyrus had in fact commissioned and paid for the rebuilding of the new Jewish temple. Darius I greenlights the project and orders the tax treasury in Samaria to pay for the rest of the construction. Work now begins in earnest. In 516 BCE, 70 years after its destruction and 23 years after the start of the return from exile, the temple is completed. It's made of hewn stone and inlaid with wood from the king's forests. The Israelites, the priests, and all the returning exiles celebrate in great joy. A sacrificial party rededicates temple service. We have officially entered the Second Temple period. You might have noticed at this point that even though we're talking about the Book of Ezra, Ezra has yet to show up. To meet him, we need to skip ahead another 50 years. So, 50 years after the Second Temple is finished, the next king of Persia, King Artaxerxes, asks a man known as Ezra the scribe, there he is, to, quote, regulate Judah and Jerusalem according to the laws of your God. The new community in Judea is, frankly, not doing very well, and Ezra, a great scholar in the books of Moses and a priest in the Persian Jewish community, is sent by the king to re-establish Jewish culture and to create the local judicial system. He will be the new spiritual leader of Judea, in essence, the first chief justice of the new nation. After his long journey, Ezra arrives to find that many in the Jewish community, including community leaders, have intermarried. This news is extremely traumatic to Ezra. He tears his clothes, he goes into public mourning. Ezra comes up with a desperate solution. He orders all the Jewish men to divorce their non-Jewish wives and to expel them and their children from the community. Ezra was deeply concerned that the Jews of Judea were violating divine law and that they would assimilate and vanish into history. What's more, the Persian Jewish community believed that God had destroyed the first temple for the sins of the people. We just finished building the second temple. Ezra doesn't want this temple destroyed as well. Ezra's book abruptly ends here. But don't worry, Ezra will show up again in the book of Nehemiah.
In the book of Nehemiah or Nehemiah. All right. Travis, I appreciate you sharing that video with me because I found it to be very helpful in getting a perspective on some of the biblical story and how it all fits together and some of that travel back and forth between Babylonia and Persia and back to Jerusalem. So now we're going to shift gears for just a few minutes and move forward in time a few centuries without a lot of background for that, because mainly what we're going to talk about very briefly is the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into the language in which the Apocrypha was written, which is the Greek language. So it was the Greek language that the apocryphal scriptures and the Hebrew scriptures were translated into. And we're going to get more into that later, but there are just two vocabulary words we need tonight. So I think you'll be able to grasp these right quickly. Koine is a term for common, I think, and it is the common Greek language spoken by many nations that were assimilated into the Greek Empire. It's kind of, if you want to think about something a little more modern, it's the way the nations who became part of the colonies of the British Empire all had to learn English to get along. Well, Greek was that language in this part of the world during these times. And so they had to learn the Koine Greek. And the other thing we're going to be talking about a little bit is what's called the Septuagint, which is simply Latin for the word, for the number 70. So therefore in Roman numerals, it is LXX. You'll see it abbreviated that way in a lot of scriptures and studies. But this is where the Hebrew scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, were translated into Greek, probably for the first time. And even though our movement along the historical timeline hasn't yet progressed to the time that parts of the Apocrypha were written, I'm going to give you a very brief background on that just so we can look at some of those texts. So how and when did we get the Septuagint as translation of the Jewish scriptures, and maybe a little bit of why, but we'll get into more of that later. So again, the Septuagint is the Greek Old Testament, it's what it's commonly called, and it's the earliest Koine Greek translation of the books from the Hebrew Bible. And of course, the Apocrypha are also written in Greek. As I understand it, archaeological findings and historical scholarship indicate that the Torah, the first 5 books, or the Pentateuch, were translated sometime in the mid-3rd century. A lot of these writings did not survive as original translations, except in very small and rare fragments. And then sometime later, the remaining books of the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek. But the Hebrew Torah was translated into Greek, according to historians, at the request of someone we haven't met yet, because we haven't got that part of the timeline. That is Ptolemy II Philadelphus, in somewhere in the mid-3rd century BC. We'll learn more about him later in the study, but just a little reference point here. The Septuagint is named for the Latin number 70 because, according to one legend, it was translated by 70 Jewish scholars over a course of just 70 days. Now, that sounds a little preposterous to me, but then again, I couldn't translate it in 70 years. But regardless of the veracity of the legend or the myth, that is what it's called. And it came into being because it satisfied a need that the Jewish community had. Because by the time these were translated, many of those in the community had a very limited knowledge of Hebrew. And even if they could speak some of it, most of them could not read it. So the Greek version of Jewish scriptures were already in wide use by the time that Jesus came along and Paul of Tarsus, because many of the proselytes, the early Christian proselytes, and those who feared Yahweh and the other Gentile sympathizers couldn't read Hebrew. So the text is, in a lot of times when you see the scriptures in the New Testament, when they quote the scriptures, if you go back and look at the Greek text, a lot of times they're actually quoting the Septuagint rather than the original Hebrew. So I'm going to stop, come back, and just before we jump into some of the apocryphal things, just it occurred to me as I was trying to figure this out is, how did they determine that these apocryphal texts weren't part of the original Jewish scriptures? Well, obviously the language was a big part of it. It reminded me of, I was thinking about our daughter, our middle child. She was the language freak of the family. She took Spanish and French in high school, and then in college, she decided to major in French. What a very useful major it was. But you think about it, if we were to one day find a diary with Holly's name on it, telling about her days in elementary school before she took French, and it was written in French, we'd know something was wrong, right? Well, the same thing with the Greek language. If you find stories in the Hebrew scriptures written in Greek, and you hadn't even got to the point where folks are speaking and writing Greek, something's got to give, right? So that's basically how I have sort of wrapped my head around it. So let's take another shift. Everybody's got your seatbelt on, right? And we're going to look at a few of the apocryphal writings. We're first going to look at Esther. One of the things about the Hebrew and Old Testament book of Esther that scholars have pointed out for centuries is that despite the fact that it's obvious that this is a part of the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, there is really no direct mention of God or Yahweh in this particular book. And I don't think there's really any direct and obvious religious language in the book either. So there are 6 parts of the apocryphal addition to Esther. I'm going to go over all 6 of those very quickly. First one is Mordecai's dream and the discovery of a conspiracy. The Apocrypha has an alternate explanation for how the whole plot of rescue for the Jewish people is given. Unlike the original Hebrew version, the Greek version of Esther provides details about a cryptic dream that Mordecai has. And it's a dream that it's pretty obvious has been inspired by divine revelation. So, hello, God, let's bring God into the story. We knew you must have been here, and this dream gives us a clue as to your presence. So Mordecai, by way of his dream, becomes more of a direct challenger in the Greek version of Esther and the Apocrypha that goes with it to Haman than does Esther. And Esther is somewhat relegated to a lesser role. But hey, she still got her name on the name of the book. I'm sure she was glad for that. Second part is the first royal letter. At the end of chapter 3, verse 13, in the original Hebrew, there is a letter that's inserted that is from the king's point of view, Esther's husband. And in it, King Xerxes, really, by way of the letter, looks kind of evil because he's attempting to justify the Haman-driven extermination of the Jews. Give you three just quick phrases that are used in the letter, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing here. I'm not quoting directly, but he says something like, I always act reasonably and with kindness. Right. Every king does that, right? He says, I am profoundly interested in the tranquility of the lives of my subjects and the stability of the kingdom, which is why you have to exterminate people, right? Right. And third thing he says, he says Haman is distinguished for his unchanging goodwill and steadfast fidelity. Yeah, that's not the picture I get of Haman. So you get the idea here. In some sense, this kind of sounds like Jewish satire. Third part of the Apocrypha for Esther is the prayer of Mordecai and the prayer of Esther. Those are put together. Remember the part about no mention of God, no religious language? Well, this prayer takes care of that because these prayers, both Mordecai's prayer and Esther's prayer, which are told separately, offer some long-standing prayer conventions. There's praise and petition, confession, prayers for God's people. And in Esther's part, in her prayer, it also includes very vivid description of her abhorrence for the whole life of Persian queendom. Everything from her disgust at royal opulence, sleeping with an uncircumcised Gentile, and even nasty Persian cuisine. So Esther's prayer and Mordecai's prayer are the third part. And then the fourth part of the Apocrypha that's in the book of Esther is when Esther appears before the king. Because in the Hebrew part, it's not a very long description, but the Apocrypha has a dramatic expansion of that Hebrew version in chapter 5, where Esther's personal feelings are explored and depicted by the text. As one of the commentaries says, they tell Esther's story with all the finesse of a popular romantic novel. It includes Esther's heart-gulping, knee-knocking, trembling, and fainting when she comes into the king's presence, as well as the king's romantic swoon to rescue her. So that's in Esther's appearance before the king, the fourth part. The fifth part is a second royal letter that comes in chapter 8 after verse 12. Really another letter of interest that is supposed to be from the king. Unlike all other Persian royal decrees, probably, the king in this letter makes admission of his mistakes in trusting Haman. I don't think kings are ever required to do that. They always find somebody else to blame. But in this part, the king admits it in the letter. And this letter, if you will, puts the hammer down on the king's support of the upcoming celebration of deliverance from Haman's wickedness, that is, the Jewish festival of Purim. The king declares that the wrath of the Persian Empire will basically rain down on anyone who refuses to join in this celebration that the Jews are going to have after they are saved from the destruction that Haman has planned for them. And the final part of Esther in the Apocrypha is at the very end, we come back to Mordecai's dream. So we get an interpretation of the dream. The Hebrew version of Esther has a very abbreviated final chapter. Chapter 10 of Esther only has 3 verses. So this last edition, interpreting Mordecai's dream, is added on at the end of verse 3 in chapter 10. And it circles back to verify and to validate the apocryphal dream that Mordecai had in the opening part of the book. So there's the apocryphal parts of Esther. And we got just a few more minutes. I'm going to jump and do a little bit from Daniel. We may not get through all of this, but the Hebrew book of Daniel, if you've never really looked at it overall, is written in 2 different formats, so to speak, because the first 6 chapters describe Daniel and his friends as wise men and dream interpreters and ideal courtiers who were observant Jews and who were unwilling to yield to idolatry. And despite this, they're able to win their way in the foreign courts of Babylonia and Persia. And the first half, the first 6 chapters of the book are written about Daniel. But in chapter 7, the narration shifts. It is written as, in some ways, like a foretelling of the future, and is written in the first person as if Daniel himself is the one who writes the rest of it. So the 3 parts of the Apocrypha that are connected to Daniel are this. There is the Song of the 3 Youths, sometimes called the Prayer of Azariah and the Song of the 3 Holy Children. This goes after 323, has basically 3 unequal parts. The Prayer of Azariah, who is actually, Azariah is the Hebrew name for Abednego. It has a brief narrative of the fate of the 3 Jews in the furnace, and then a hymn sung by the 3 youths while they're in the furnace. It gives much more detail to the miracle of the fiery furnace, and it kind of lessens the jolt that's a real shift between 323 and 324. Because in 323, the Hebrew says, the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the furnace of the blazing fire. You remember from the story, it was so hot that the people that were throwing them into the fire were consumed and died before they could even really throw them into the fire very well. And then immediately Nebuchadnezzar jumps up and says, was it not 3 men that we bound into the fire? And he says, I see 4 men walking around the middle of the fire and they're not hurt. And the 4th one. So this is kind of an in between that to explain a little bit about what's going on. There's Azariah's prayer, which is a proclamation of God's justice in punishing the sin of Israel. He makes a petition for mercy, a pledge for worship, and then makes a call on God for help. And then the youth's prayer has 5 really brief sections. There's a doxology to the heavenly enthroned God, praise addressed to the heavenly creatures, and then praise addressed to the creatures between heaven and earth, and praise addressed to the creatures on the earth. We got everybody covered here in this prayer. And then praise addressed to all humanity, including Israel. And then the last 2 parts, I think I'll be able to get these in really quickly, are what some scholars have called the detective additions to Daniel. One of them is called Susanna, and the other one is called Bel and the Dragon. So in Susanna, there's several versions of the story, but Susanna is a female who is married to a very wealthy Jew in Babylon. And of course, as a female in that culture, mostly her importance is as a wife. But according to the story, Susanna is very beautiful, but the narrator makes a very clear point to let us know that Susanna is a very faithful follower of Yahweh and is very well versed in the Jewish scriptures. So Susanna's story has Daniel as a wise young detective. And the brief part of the story says there are 2 old judges who become infatuated and in fact inflamed in love with Susanna. They have seen her walking in the garden and they try to force her to yield to their lust, and she refuses. And so they accuse her of committing adultery with a young man who escaped. Isn't that funny how that happens? 2 people get charged with adultery and one of them is not even there. Does that sound familiar? When they brought the woman who was charged with adultery to Jesus by herself, how does that work? Well, the same thing happens in this story, but what happens to rescue Susanna is that Daniel essentially cross-examines these 2 judges separately to ask them about what they remember of seeing these 2. And the first one that he cross-examines says, oh yes, she was surprised under a mastic tree, whatever kind of tree that is. And so then when he got the other one in there and asked him, he says, oh yeah, she was surprised by her attacker under a home tree. So two different kind of trees were enough to get the charge thrown out. So Susanna was saved, and instead of her being executed for adultery, the two judges are executed. So the moral of the story is know your trees and get your story straight. Okay. All right. Now, the last part, Bel and the Dragon. Gosh, this has got to be my favorite. I think I'm going to go back and read this over and over. This is placed after the 12th chapter of Daniel in the Greek translation, sort of as an epilogue. And in this tale, Daniel's detective work reveals that a big brass idol that's in the Babylonian temple, which the priests have tried to convince everybody, miraculously consumes all of the food that people bring to sacrifice to it. Daniel proves, in fact, that it is a front for a corrupt priesthood who are stealing these offerings. And the way he does it is he tells the king, he said, look, he said, this idol here in this temple, he said, if you bring food in here and put it in front of the idol, and then we lock the doors and seal them so that no one can get in overnight, that food will not be consumed. And so the king says, okay, this is how we'll do it. So they put the food in there. Well, I think Daniel already knew that the priest had built a trap door under the temple so that they could sneak in and get the food. But Daniel's pretty smart because he takes ashes and scatters them on the floor as he leaves the temple. So at night, when the priest and their family come in and eat up all the food to prove that the brass idol is real, they leave their footprints all over the temple floor. And the next day they come back and they say, look, the food is gone. And Daniel says, yeah, and whose footprints are these in the ash here? And so that's how Daniel kept this. He debunked this brass idol that they had. Well, that's not the dragon, because there's another story that's the second part of Bel and the Dragon, because the Babylonians also worshipped a dragon, and this was supposedly a real dragon. And Daniel, of course, just like in the Hebrew, Daniel refused to worship this dragon. And in order to prove that this dragon was not divine, Daniel boiled together pitch, fat, and hair. So basically a greasy fur ball, which he feeds to the dragon. And when the dragon eats it, he explodes. And that's how he destroys the dragon. And so because this is sort of sacrilegious, Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, but nothing happens to him. Indeed, the Apocrypha says that he was given a dinner by the prophet Habakkuk, who was brought there by the hair of his head by an angel. And on the seventh day, after being in the lion's den for 7 days, the king goes back and Daniel's still sitting there. So he's let out, and those who accused him are thrown in. And of course, the lion devours them. So the second half of this video, which is even shorter than the first one, and then we'll close on that. Okay. There we go.
Nehemiah, at the opening of his book, is cupbearer to the same king Artaxerxes. That means he's the king's sommelier, the wine steward, which is a title of high rank in any palace. One day, Nehemiah is talking to some Judeans visiting the palace and learns that the people of Judea are in really bad shape. He also learns that the walls of Jerusalem are still breached and that the city is vulnerable to attack. He asks the king of Persia if he, Nehemiah, could be made governor of Judea to take care of and protect his people. King Artaxerxes allows it, and he sends Nehemiah to Judea with a letter to the keeper of the king's park. The keeper is to supply Nehemiah with all the lumber he might need for any project he deems necessary. When Nehemiah gets to Jerusalem, he sees that the stories are true. Sure, the temple's been rebuilt, but the walls are still breached and the gates are still destroyed from the Babylonian siege 130 years earlier. A volunteer workforce is assembled. They're motivated, to say the least. The breaches to the walls and the city gates are all repaired in 52 days. With the city secured, Nehemiah now addresses another quality of life issue, the scourge of debt. There's a rich upper class in the state of Judah. The majority of the Jews, however, are poor and indebted to the wealthy. People have sold their fields and have even sold themselves into bondage, all in hope of gaining relief, but the debts keep mounting. Nehemiah gathers the community together. In this assembly, the poor vastly outnumber the rich. He publicly shames the members of the upper class who indebted their brethren. The Jews have been brought out of indentured servitude in Persia at great expense, he tells them. It was not so they could now live in indentured servitude in Judea. One after another, Nehemiah has the predatory lenders step forward, forgive the debts owed them, and return the people's land to them. This is, in effect, the first sabbatical year of this new Jewish community. This is where Ezra shows up in Nehemiah's book. The two work together. Ezra reads the Torah of Moses, i.e. the Bible, to the entire community, men and women from dawn to midday, while priests translate and explain. There was not yet a custom of regular public readings of the Torah, and the people are completely overwhelmed. They weep hearing the words of God. Ezra, Nehemiah, and the priests tell them, this is a day of celebration. There's no need to be sad. 24 days later, Ezra again convenes the community and again reads the Torah to them. The community leaders are inspired and they sign a pledge to follow the teachings of God given through Moses. They vow not to intermarry, they vow to let the land lie fallow and to forgive all debts every 7 years. They vow to pay a tithe, meaning a tenth of their income as a tax to the temple, and to maintain the temple with food and sacrifices and fuel for the altar. They vow not to buy goods from the locals on the Sabbath. Nehemiah continues his work. Though Jerusalem's walls are rebuilt, the city inside is still mostly a ruin. Most Jews opt to live out in the countryside. Nehemiah has the people draw lots, and he forcibly moves 1 out of every 10 Judeans back into the city. And then he comes across the same problem that Ezra had been struggling with. The community continues to intermarry, and now their children don't even know how to speak Hebrew. Nehemiah resorts to flogging the men who have non-Jewish wives. Nehemiah ends his book with a prayer to God. He says, I purified the priesthood and the people and reestablished the temple service. He's essentially saying to God, I did everything I could. Thus ends the second to last book of the Bible. For his part, Ezra is credited with adding new and important elements to Judaism. His gatherings of the community to read the Torah of Moses established the practice of publicly reading the Bible every Monday and Thursday morning, as well as every Sabbath afternoon. Later, the rabbis of the Talmud added a reading to the Sabbath morning service. Ezra is also credited with convening the First Great Assembly, a deliberative body of prophets, scholars, and judges that later became the Jewish Supreme Court of the Second Temple period. He's also credited with writing his self-titled book, as well as the books of Malachi and Chronicles 1 and 2. The framework of the Jewish biblical canon, known in Hebrew as the Tanakh, starts with the creation of the world and ends with the building of the Second Temple. Unfortunately for later generations, the policies of the Roman Empire and the Jewish response to them would lead to the destruction of the Second Temple, which stood as the center of Jewish sacrificial worship for 580 years. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notifications so you'll know when we upload new videos.
All right. So there you go. Questions or comments before we head out for the evening? Your seatbelts hold you safe? No whiplash?
This is a lot of stuff to process. God, it's overwhelming.
I agree. It takes me days to process.
Good grief.
Well, the good thing is the video will be up in a little while and you can go back and watch it a minute at a time and soak it all in if you want. And I'll also send you, by the way, I'm going to send you a list. Most of what I'm going to offer for you to read this week would be some of those apocryphal readings that I just told you a little bit about. Mm-hmm. And by way of doing that, you can look those up online. BibleGateway.com has the Apocrypha in it. But I also have 3 Bibles at the church that have the Apocrypha in it. And all those stories that I just told you tonight, I've also printed those off from Bible Gateway. So I have 4 total copies. If any of you are really paper readers and don't want to go look it up online, you can contact me and borrow one of those Bibles to look at those, or that printed copy. Okay. And you don't have to read them at all if you don't want to, because we're moving on to something else next week, right, Nellie?
Of course.
So
All right.
So
Sounds
Todd,
like that part of the country is as confused today as it was then. I
Well,
don't
it may
know.
have been the whole way. Yes, Jamie.
where do we go to watch the recording?
To watch this video,
Yes. Uh-huh.
I'll send you the link in about an hour.
Okay, so you will send us links so that we can go back in and watch.
Right.
'Cause
I'm recording it now. And so as soon as it finishes recording, I'll upload it to the church's YouTube channel and then send you all a link.
Okay. churches-
So,
Okay.
so
Go
we're
ahead, Nick.
talking about time from the end of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament.
Right. And we haven't even gotten into any of that time yet. We're just
We're still at-
clarifying the end of the Old Testament now.
Okay.
Once we get into Alexander and the Greeks, that's the intertestamental period. And we'll be jumping right into that next week
Okay.
with both feet, like Brer Rabbit. All right. Thank you all.
All right.
Thank
Thank you, Todd.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.